Now in this lecture, I want to return to the topic of routing and navigation and just look at some more features that we can avail of in the React Router library. The slides for this lecture are behind this card again, and it's these slides here. And we'll be looking at some sample code, but again, the sample code is linked to the first time I looked at navigation. You might remember I had a whole bunch of samples, but I only looked at the first 3 or so in that earlier lecture. So the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of nested routes. So far, we've seen route entries only at the very top level in our component hierarchy, but it turns out you can actually have route entries inside in ordinary components. So I'm saying the objective is to have a component's child components actually somehow dynamically determined based on the current URL in the browser. And this again kind of addresses or adheres to this kind of addressability kind of characteristic that we like to maintain in our web apps. So let's look at an example of these nested routes. Now, the little case study that we're using, if you remember, is one where we had 3 very simple pages in our app, a home page, an about page, and an inbox page. And let's supposing we've got this situation. So we have a route relating to the URL /inbox/user ID. And if the browser's URL kind of matches that, then the app will mount the inbox component. But now I'm saying, what if the URL actually had an extension onto that base URL, and the extension could either be /statistics or /drafts, as in some statistics on a person's email and maybe some draft emails, Maria. So these are 2 kind of sub-routes within this major route, or to use the React Router terminology, these are 2 nested routes within the major route. And what I want from a component point of view is if the URL has the /statistics part added onto it, then React should mount the inbox component and the stats component. Whereas if the URL ends in /draft, then it should mount the inbox component and the draft component. And so the way it works is that in our inbox component, we can actually, as you see here, we can actually include route entries within an ordinary component. Hence, we refer to these route entries as nested routes. And in the nested route, again, you give the full URL, an absolute URL, and you specify the new component that you want to have mounted. So it's as simple as that, really. If we look at the full code, so we're told it's sample 4. So in my base index.js, I've already pointing it at sample 4. And so if I just start up my server, and so by way of illustration, I've just put some hyperlinks here in the home page. And again, if you just follow what's happening on the URL side, if I click this link, then it's the original case where I just have the /inbox followed by a user's ID. And so the inbox component is all that's being mounted in this case. Whereas if I take this link, I now have the /statistics bit at the end, and it's my statistics component that's actually rendering the extra bit of UI. And finally, in this case, the draft component is rendering the additional bit of UI. Just to quickly look at the full code. that comprises this sample. So there isn't a whole lot new, if anything, really, in the index.js, my home page. I'm importing the about, I think, and here's my high-level routing. So nothing new there. So this base route still exists, and the inbox component is what I showed you from the slides. I'm importing it. So here's my inbox component, and here are my nested routes. Now, not for any particular reason, I've created a new component called message there, which is just rendering the original kind of content of the inbox component. And here are my two additional components. I've wrapped my inbox component with the router function because I'm referring to props.match above here, so I need that. Okay, so that's it really. And again, it's a kind of a design decision to start using nested routes. Typically what you might find yourself doing is refactoring some code to introduce these nested routes. And the reason we like these nested routes is, again, to adhere to the addressability kind of characteristic of the web, as well as its better separation of concerns in terms of our code. And it's probably also a good idea not to have too much routing configuration at the very top level. If you can delegate some of the routing logic to lower level components in your hierarchy, that's also kind of considered good design, rather than having it all in one component at the very top of the hierarchy. It can get quite cluttered for large applications when you've got that situation. So that's nested routes. Next thing I want to look at is to revisit the link component. You remember we use the link component to implement hyperlinks, internal hyperlinks within our React app. Now there are some times when you want to actually pass some props from the link component to whatever component is eventually mounted as a result of the user clicking the link. Okay, so by way of example, let's supposing when the user clicks the inbox link in this little case study, I want to pass some additional props to the inbox component. And I know what those props are within the code of my home page, which is what I'm looking at here. So this is how you would actually code the link entry. And so you can see there that the t prop of the link is now actually an object rather than just as previously it was just a string. And the object that I'm passing to my t prop has a number of predefined keys. The path name key has to contain the URL associated with the hyperlink. So in this case anyway, if the user clicks on this link, the browser's URL is just going to change to /inbox. I left out the parameterized part just for simplicity's sake. The state key then, which is this additional one here. The state key is where you include the additional props that you want to make available to the kind of receiving component, which is my inbox component in this case. So I've just come up with meaningless props, really, alpha and beta, and assigned those values. But really what I want to prove is that inside in my inbox component, I can actually access these two additional props. So to continue the picture now, this link is going to match, let's say, this entry in my high-level routing configuration. And so the root entry says there that if the URL is /inbox, then it should mount the inbox component. And eventually, inside the inbox component, here is where I'm showing you how to get at the two additional props, the alpha and beta that was defined. So there's yet another prop called the location prop, which is just another default prop that's made available to your components. And the location prop contains the state additional props that we wanted to pass on. So all I'm doing there is just I'm using destructuring of props.location.state to access my alpha beta, and I'm just displaying my alpha beta values to prove that I can access these two props. So I think you can look at sample 5 yourself. Other than the link, there's nothing terribly new there. What I'm showing you here is just your typical layout of a web app. And this is just by way of convention over the years, really. So what I'm trying to get across here is that typically web apps tend to have a header part that remains static across all the pages that you and views that you navigate across. Typically there's a footer part that also remains static from page to page or view to view. There may even be a side menu that remains static. And typically it's this area in the middle of the UI that changes as the user navigates around the app. So this part is dynamic, but most of the other parts, in fact, definitely the other parts, the header and the footer, are static. So the question is, how do we get these static parts, header and footer, just by a big example, how do we code these static parts in our React implementation? And to illustrate it, again, taking our little case study. So in my home page, I want this standard header and I want this footer. And if I go to any one of the other pages, the header and footer will remain persistent or constant. So this is what React Router calls persistent elements. How you achieve it is in the main routing configuration component. You simply stick in the JSX that generates the persistent header and footer. And I've decided to extract my header and my footer into separate components. You don't have to, but it would make sense, I think. Otherwise, the code here would be very bloated. So I've got a separate header and footer component that renders the headers and footers that you saw on the previous screen. So this is sample 6. We'll just change it to sample 6. This is how it renders, and as I navigate around from page to page, my headers and my kind of footer remains constant across all views. And the source code, really the main new features are we've got these two components, header and footer. They're kind of static in one sense because they don't actually receive any props, but that's just coincidental. There's nothing wrong with the header and footer receiving props. Just a lot of styling going on, which is why I've got the app.css, and I am using the Bootstrap styling library, which you may be familiar with, and the index.js. The main feature really is the top level component with the header and footer references in the routing configuration. That's it for this lecture. And all of those 3 features that I've looked at now are used in the accompanying lab. And we've got 1 or 2 other routing issues to address in a subsequent lecture. Okay, see you later.